joining me today to talk about vaccine hesitancy. I do want to acknowledge that I'm meeting on the lands of the Kaurna people and that I respect their spiritual relationship with country. I also want to acknowledge the cultural authority of the Aboriginal people who would be joining us today, and thank you for coming along. So what I'll be talking about is basically an evidence-based approach to vaccine hesitancy. And I do realise that we have a mixed group of people here. For some people, you will have really substantial knowledge about vaccination, and this is probably just a confirmation that you're already completely across what you're doing, and for others, possibly less so. So I will have to, I'll go through all of it and acknowledging that for some of you, it'll be, old knowledge for you. And thanks to Bernie for helping to organise this. Terrific. Okay, so I will talk about the role of the vaccine in COVID control and the common questions that we know we get asked, and then talk about the style of communication which is the most effective. So just to start us off really with the whole of COVID control. We obviously have vaccines now, which is a fantastic addition to the toolkit, but we still really need to keep a lot of the other activities in place. And this is a really important message for the community. We still have to do the COVID safe check-in. We still have to have all our respiratory hygiene practices that everyone's well accustomed to now. And of course, there may still be restrictions going forward, and people still need to have that in mind. So to put it right up front, the Delta variant is different to the original Wuhan variant that we had through last year. It's much more infectious. It's at least doubly infectious than the original strain. Unfortunately, it does also cause severer disease. And the Delta variant has taken over completely, and it is the dominant and only strain in Australia. So this slide comes from the Doherty modelling report that you may well have all heard about, that was released in August. And I'll just take you through this slide. On the far right is transmission potential. So basically, if we can get the transmission potential under 1, we will have a dying outbreak. So we'll start to drop off. Where we are now with Delta, in a community non-immune, which is all of us effectively, and with no test, trace, isolation and quarantine, we basically have, for every 1 person who's infected with a Delta variant, 8 further people become infected. So that's really what that means, is what it is when it's kind of let loose. We have the test, trace, isolation and quarantine, otherwise known as contact tracing. We have other important public health baseline measures like the respiratory hygiene, the masks. Those things actually bring the transmission potential down in themselves. But if you look at the role of vaccination, which is the purple area, so when we get to about 80% coverage plus those baseline public health measures, we get that transmission potential closer to 1. And that's really the basis of what this is about, that we still, going forward, we'll need the test, trace, isolation, quarantine. We'll still need basic public health measures, but what we're trying to not have to do is get into the dark green, which is basically lockdown. So that's really the basis for which people have been talking about this 80%. But you can see full well that if we got it to 90 or 95, the higher the vaccination rates go, the less of the public health additional measures we'll ever need. That's what we're aiming for. So the vaccines we have are very effective, and I need to apologise in advance. I have hay fever, and so my voice does sometimes go, but I will just, if you can ignore the crackling, I'll keep pushing through. So the vaccines do reduce the risk of becoming infected, but really where they're most effective is in reducing the risk of hospitalisation, ICU admission and death. So Pfizer and AstraZeneca and Moderna actually performs pretty similarly, are both similar in their ability to reduce hospitalisation, so around 87 or 86%, reducing ICU admission, again around the same rate, and reducing the chance of death 90 or higher. So while it's not able to stop all infection, it's certainly able to have a profound influence on whether people die. The vaccines as well are known to reduce onward transmission by about half. So if a vaccinated person becomes infected, they'll infect less people than an unvaccinated person who's infected, bringing it, in fact, more into line with the original Wuhan variant with the Delta strain. We do have the 3 vaccines now. Pfizer and Moderna are both available from 12 years old. AstraZeneca is still available. It is the case that it's becoming a less preferred vaccine. But for some people, AstraZeneca is still the best vaccine to have. Pfizer, many of you will know, is a 3-week window between vaccines. AstraZeneca 12, Moderna is 4. And Moderna's only been available in pharmacies now for just over a week. But there's already been a good uptake. Just to be clear about what vaccine efficacy actually means, because we use these terms 80% reduction, they're actually reasonably abstract. This slide tries to make it clearer. So it's the difference in infections between the vaccinated group and those who were given placebo. So you see, we're just taking, if you go from where is the 0 to 100%, we're just talking about amongst the people infected in the placebo group. What's the difference with the vaccinated group? So you still do get, with these vaccines, you still do get 2-3 infections. So per, like it's in 20 to 30% infections because of the vaccines not perfectly preventing infection, but there's a substantial reduction. So I'll just spend a moment talking through the ways the different vaccines work. I do think it's important to understand, because some of the questions people have about, some of the myths really about the vaccine kind of need you to know how they work. So Pfizer and Moderna, both messenger RNA vaccines, they basically have a little piece of this messenger RNA, which is a single strand, it's only a component, and that is taken into it's injected into the body. It has a lipid covering that allows that vaccine to get into your cell. It's taken into the cell, and it then uses the cell's machinery, like our kind of factory, to create spike protein. The mRNA is then destroyed, so it doesn't move from there, it doesn't go back into the bloodstream, it doesn't go into the nucleus of the cell, it just has the instructions there. The instructions are used to make the protein. The protein is then taken to the surface of the cell, and then our immune system sees that as foreign and starts to develop an immune response. So that actually is the same for Moderna and Pfizer. AstraZeneca uses an adenovirus vector, so that means that it's got a small piece of DNA this time, and that is within a virus, and that virus helps it to deliver to the cell, but it is in itself a harmless virus. And again, that DNA uses the machinery of the cell to create spike protein, again to put it onto the surface of the cell and activate the immune response. So, that DNA does not ever enter into our cell nucleus where our DNA resides. It also gets destroyed in the cell and doesn't make its way around the body. So vaccine safety is really the predominant concern that people have. And it is important to know that the processes are in place to ensure that the vaccine is safe, or any drug for that matter. So the Therapeutic Goods Administration has the job of licensing vaccines or registering them for Australia. Vaccines, all drugs, even medical devices. So they are responsible for safety, basically, of any kind of health intervention. And they've used those same safety processes with these vaccines as they would always. the Australian Technical Advisory Group on Immunisation, or ATAGI, is an additional group when it comes to vaccines, and that group is responsible for deciding how those vaccines will be used. So traditionally, it's been about the National Immunisation Program for Children, which has a lot of vaccines and is reasonably complicated, and there's quite a bit of science that goes into how that is structured. So it's that same group that's making the decisions about how the vaccines will be used. So it's the combination of the two that's the safety mechanism within Australia. So vaccines, as with any other drug, have common side effects. And these are pretty similar to others, such as influenza vaccine. So it's usually within 1 to 3 days. The general kind of sore arm, tiredness, headache, fever, that kind of feeling that you might be coming down with something is common. It's not dangerous, and it's short-lived. We do hear that for some people the sore arm can last longer than a few days, but it is self-limiting and resolves. In fact, I guess one of the things to be aware of, all of these symptoms are actually symptoms of your immune system kicking in. So it's kind of a sign that the vaccine's working for you, because you're getting a lot of that feeling of unwellness is feeling your immune system kicking in. So there are, of course, more serious side effects, and when talking about the vaccine, it is important to not exclude these, because we need to be open and transparent about what we know. So allergic reactions are rare, but they happen. They happen to basically every drug, including the vaccines. But these vaccines are delivered by people who have training in anaphylaxis treatment, and people are able to get that treatment at the very same time as the vaccine and immediately after. So that's something that's imminently treatable, but it is a serious side effect. Rare, of course. For Pfizer and Moderna, the mRNA vaccines, there is a risk of inflammation of the heart muscle or the kind of surrounding of the heart muscle, so the pericardium. So it's called myocarditis and pericarditis. That tends to happen after the second dose of vaccine, and usually between 1 to 5 days after the vaccine itself. It's much more common in young men, so men under 30, but it can happen to other people. The rate is around 2.7 per 100,000 dose, so obviously rare, less than 1%. People present with some chest pain, shortness of breath, palpitations, and while they are unwell and most certainly need to have medical care, to date, it's always been a mild side effect, effectively, that is imminently treatable and resolves. And nobody to date has had any long-term consequence or morbidity or problems with their heart thereafter. So it is usually, though, that second dose, so people are basically already finished their vaccine when this happens. But yes, very rare. The other vaccine side effects that you will have all heard about with AstraZeneca is the clotting disease, being thrombosis with thrombocytopenia syndrome. This is now accepted to be a known rare side effect of the vaccine. So the risk is around 1 in 50,000 of having one of these clots. The risk of dying, however, is much lower. It's less than 1 in 1 million. And that's because now people are much better at identifying it early, and people obviously need to be told when they're, as part of the consent process with the vaccine, what to look out for and to present early. The treatment is also improved. So it is rare. And I guess to put that those numbers in context, so that's risk of dying is less than 1 in 1 million. The risk of dying if you catch COVID is 42,000 in a million. So we really are talking about substantially different scales. That said, we do realise that for some people, selecting a Pfizer or Moderna vaccine is their preference, and we certainly are supporting people to make that choice now. I also say another interesting comparison is apparently the risk of being struck by lightning is 2 in a million. So you're more likely to be struck by lightning. I think that's quite remarkable. So, okay, the other thing that's important to note is that everybody can get the vaccine for free. So that's including people who aren't on Medicare. They do need to go to the vaccine with photo ID, and the people will sort out a health identifier for them so that they can be registered on the Australian Immunisation Register. But it is important that people realise money or having a Medicare card is not necessary. People often ask about switching between vaccines, and sometimes that's happening, for example, where people have had a first AstraZeneca and now would prefer to have a Pfizer or Moderna second dose. At this stage, the ATAGI group are not recommending that that happens. There is work underway, there's more research being conducted, and it's certainly other countries have been doing this. So in time, there will be more information about the safety of that, which is probably the greatest consideration. I think everybody believes that it will be effective, but will it be safe? That's really the question that needs to be answered. There are definitely times when you would not have a second dose of the same vaccine. So, for example, if you did get the TTS with AstraZeneca, you're clearly not getting that vaccine again. You would get an mRNA. So where you've had a side effect from one, you will switch. There will be a recommendation to switch to the other. So the safety questions are the most important questions that we get. There is concern amongst some people that there are all sorts of additional things added into vaccines, and there are people who do think that there's a microchip or some other kind of device that's been added. It is important really just to be quite clear that the vaccine has a protein component, whether it's the protein itself or whether it's the genetic instructions to make the protein, a bit of fat, and that does help it move through cells. A substance to boost the immune response, which is called an adjuvant, a small amount of preservative and salt water. So it doesn't really, there's nothing else. And for some people, it will be enough to hear that from a trusted person. But for others, there will still be that concern. A lot of people do ask the question and are concerned about the perceived rapidness of development of the vaccines. And there are lots of reasons why it has been they have been developed so quickly. One is there's been a lot of money. So there hasn't been a need to apply for grants in a very slow, long-winded process and get the money, 6 months later. And so that normal process was circumvented. There was also collaboration where there's not normally collaboration, which obviously helped the progress. New technologies, so the mRNA vaccine platforms had actually been in development for more than 10 years. So while the vaccine itself was new, the actual technology to get there was not new. The other thing is that millions of people around the world volunteered. Normally, it's a very slow process to get people volunteering for a trial drug, but it was not the case with these vaccines. There were lots of people who were happy to be part of the trials. Also, there was a lot of virus, and so it was very short time between the placebo group and the vaccine group to be able to get enough infections to see a difference between them. That's not the case, obviously, with rare or rarer, like meningococcus, for example. Those trials took a very long time because it's a rare disease. There was also some parallel processes in place. So there are phase 1, 2 and 3 trials that are conducted for vaccines, and for some of them, they laid phase 1, immediately flowed to phase 2, and when there was enough data to say this is fine, they moved to phase 3. So there was actually some, in a way, parallel processes that would not normally be the case. But the process of approval for the TGA was not shortened or changed in any way. Okay, so a question that people ask is, can the vaccine give me COVID? And no, it can't, because it only contains a protein. it is not a live virus, or at least not a live vaccine, at least the ones that have been approved in Australia. And long-term side effects, people are concerned about this. There's actually no vaccines that cause side effects beyond 3 months. And so I guess from a basic biological perspective, we wouldn't expect to see them. The vaccines have been used for some time. There's no evidence that there's any delayed side effects of the vaccine. But it is also the case that monitoring is conducted. So this is normal for any vaccine. It's not just this vaccine, but there's an extensive system that, well, people will have known. You get kind of those text messages asking you for your side effects, which is a bit, I guess using new technology. But in fact, this kind of monitoring of vaccine safety happens routinely. So if there were issues, I know we would uncover them, but there's certainly been no evidence for it to date. So do COVID-19 vaccines impact fertility? This is possibly the most significant concern that people have. So, I mean, the short answer is no, there's no evidence that it does. The vaccine, there's been over 6 billion vaccines delivered around the world. Obviously, there's been a lot that's been delivered within the United States and Israel, and they do have more stringent vaccine safety programs, which would allow us to see, what is the performance of these vaccines in the real world. So pregnant people have basically the same side effects as people who are not pregnant. So there's that. There has, apart from the real world evidence that there's no sign of concern with pregnancy, there have been some studies, although they're not very large. There were 4 studies conducted in the United States and Israel on the mRNA vaccines on people who were undergoing fertility treatment, and they found it didn't affect the quality or number of eggs or fertility rate for people who were undergoing treatment. That was for women. They've also had 2 studies in men that found that the mRNA vaccine didn't affect the quality of the sperm. So there are kind of concrete trials. There's the real world evidence, and there's even just that basic biological plausibility, which we can't envisage any biologically plausible way in which these vaccines could affect fertility. I should say that for some people that concern stems from the fact that these are have those genetic codes, that it could interfere with our DNA. And as I've talked about already, it doesn't have anything to do with our nucleus or our DNA, so that's not a mechanism for it. Some people have talked about a concern that a protein, the spike protein, is the same as a placental protein. And that's the kind of theory that people are pulling together. They're actually not the same proteins, but even further than that, if we imagine that a spike protein causes a massive immune response, which we know it does, because that's what happens with COVID, it's what happens with the COVID vaccines. You can imagine if a placental protein was the same, we would equally, at pregnancy, with the placenta form, attack the placenta. Our immune system would do it. So almost by definition, they can't be the same. Otherwise, there would be no fertility. But this is still a big concern for people. And as I've said, I won't dwell on this, I've talked about it twice, it doesn't change our DNA. Now, immunocompromised people are most certainly being encouraged to be vaccinated, and that's because it's a protective mechanism and they're vulnerable to infection. But if people are immunocompromised, they should speak with their doctors about when the timing of vaccination, because there might be better times than not, relating to, for example, if people are on chemotherapy, timing it so that your immune system isn't at its lowest point when you're vaccinated is good, because what we want is an immune response. But it's most certainly safe. And I've just talked about the cancer. So can I have the vaccine if I'm pregnant? And yes is the answer. The vaccine has been given to a very large number of pregnant people around the world, and this is the mRNA vaccines, and there's no sign of any issues with that. It is definitely the case that pregnant people are 5 times more likely to be admitted to hospital if they become infected with COVID, 2 to 3 times more likely of needing ICU treatment, and 1.5 times higher risk of preterm birth. So the risk of COVID infection is high, and there is no evidence of any risk of being vaccinated in pregnancy. So we're absolutely encouraging people at any stage of pregnancy to be vaccinated. So, and people can be vaccinated while breastfeeding equally. In fact, there is evidence that some of those antibodies cross over through the milk and protect the baby. So the vaccines don't contain any food products, so people can be assured of that. There's no pork products. It doesn't have fetal cells in it either, which is a concern that people have. And if people have other allergies, other than, of course, allergies to components of the vaccine, which would mean that you could not be vaccinated with that vaccine. If you have an allergy, when you go to get your vaccine, they'll ask you to stay around for 30 minutes rather than 15 minutes, just observing for any vaccine effects. But yes, the two do not cross over. Okay, so after the vaccine, people basically, after the first vaccination, people get usually get a good immune response, but it does wane pretty quickly. That's the role of the second vaccine, and it does get timed to when the actual immune, like your antibodies are lowering, you get that second one and it boosts you up again. And then it provides more long-term immune memory. But it does take 2 weeks after the second dose to be considered immune. So it's not, I guess it's important that people understand that it does take some time. And people can, as I've talked about, there's a reduced chance of catching COVID after the vaccine, but it's not zero. Reduced chance of transmitting the infection to others, but really it's a vaccine to prevent serious illness and death. It's really important that people understand after they're vaccinated that you can still catch it, and therefore if you're sick, you still need to be tested. So booster shots, there's no, the jury's out on it, I think I should probably say. ATAGI is looking at this. It's an important question for us going forward. You might have seen that other countries are now boosting people who were likely to not have had such a good immune response to the vaccine in the first place, so that being older people or people with serious illness. We will see in time, hopefully over the next few months, whether that's where ATAGI's advice goes. But in the meantime, we don't really know whether we would need regular boosters or any boosters for that matter. Okay, so that's the end of the section, just talking about the kind of facts about the vaccine. I might just stop and see if anybody has any questions before I move on to communication style. No? Okay. I'll keep going. So vaccine hesitancy. This is actually a new definition that's only been published in the last month, because obviously this is now a very big matter for the world. Vaccine hesitancy refers to a motivational state of being conflicted about or opposed to getting vaccinated. It includes intentions and willingness. So there are a number of factors that influence hesitancy. I've already alluded to safety concerns, but in South Australia, we've been talking to, surveying people since January about how they feel about their prospects of being vaccinated, and now we're getting people who are vaccinated as well as asking them would they. And the main issues we hear that people have about not being vaccinated are concerns about safety, low perceived risk of disease, or lack of information. So where people just don't have enough information to help them make a decision. There are certainly groups of people for whom lack of trust in stakeholders, lack of trust in science or in government are really important factors for them. Some people are, might say, oh, it's not even effective, so why would I bother? But that's usually wrapped up in other concerns as well. So hesitancy or willingness to be vaccinated is on a continuum. It has always been for every other vaccine as well. But with this vaccine, we have much higher degree of hesitancy than we would normally see. We normally have sort of 2 to 3% of people who are complete vaccine refusers. And then there'll be another 4 or 5% of people for whom they have concerns and there's a hesitancy related conversation. What we have now is around 7 to 9% of people who are saying that they're complete vaccine refusers, and which is obviously more than usual. And we have up to 30, them plus another 23% of people are hesitant. So we've now gone from a very small proportion of the population to actually substantial. And hesitancy differs by groups. So Aboriginal community has a very high degree of hesitancy, as do people with serious mental illness, unemployed people, and some young people. There are also some culturally and linguistically diverse communities who are hesitant, but not all. So what we're trying to achieve, though, is in our communication for the people who are hesitant is really to talk about their concerns directly. And I'll talk a bit more about that in time. But what we're trying to do as well is if we identify we have someone who's an extreme vaccine refuser, that we just identify that and then kind of politely would be backing out of that conversation because there's not really value in entering into that kind of conflict. For people who are rejecting the vaccine, and we can see that that's what's happening, the goal is really to maintain trust and to not isolate and put the person into a defensive mode. So that's really, today we're just really talking about hesitant and rejecting. I should also say that hesitancy fluctuates. So a person, we definitely see, for example, when there's media that's positive about the vaccine, hesitancy reduces. We see when the concerns about the clots with AstraZeneca rose, so did vaccine hesitancy. So it's very context specific. So now, in terms of what motivates people to be vaccinated, this is not just the opposite of what stops them from being vaccinated, but thinking that COVID is an important disease and people are at risk of catching it, having confidence in the vaccines, having trust in scientists, wanting to protect others, so that kind of altruistic framing is important. Role models are particularly important for communities because there's an important role of social norming with vaccination. So if the vaccine program is considered normal and everybody does it, then it's more encouraging for others. Trust in government and health systems is really important. Now, for people who see a healthcare provider, and I think the evidence is really healthcare provider, but I imagine that it works as well for other kind of care service providers. A recommendation to vaccinate is the most powerful influencer over a person's decision to vaccinate. And really that's part of why we're having the conversation today, because even if a healthcare worker themselves is vaccinated, they've had their family vaccinated, and they're supportive of vaccination, but someone asks them a question and they immediately concerned that they don't know what to say, how should they respond. That kind of hesitancy from the healthcare work can be interpreted as, oh, there must be something wrong with the vaccine, I'll just back out of that. So it is important that it's kind of delivered in a confident way to help people come to that decision. And of course, vaccines have to be convenient. So a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about is pretty, I guess, sensible, if you like, that many of you will already know and do. But we're really trying to empower people to make evidence-informed choices. So it's really about putting that agency in the person rather than ourselves. We want to encourage trust in health authorities that are responsible for the vaccination program. And also, obviously, we need to facilitate access. So I've already talked about the important role of healthcare workers, so I'll just keep going. So what can healthcare workers do? Well, the first is a positive recommendation to vaccinate. That really is quite important, and I will talk through a couple of scenarios that kind of show how that can happen. People having awareness and knowledge of the vaccine is important because it helps healthcare workers to be more willing to have a conversation because they feel like they will have some answers to the questions. It's important for any messages to be delivered in an honest, culturally appropriate and consistent way. And that's kind of obvious to many of you. And apart from recommending vaccination, we also need to include timeliness in that. There are definitely people who think that they can wait for the virus to arrive and see that it's kind of getting out of hand and then get vaccinated. But, you know, for Pfizer, which is the fastest, it takes 5 weeks from the first vaccine to be immune, and that can sometimes be too long. Okay, so key components of an effective strategy. This is what we are trying to do in South Australia, but I thought I would just share with you, but that we really are trying to go directly to the individual groups of hesitant people. We are trying to increase their knowledge and awareness, and sometimes that's correcting misinformation. We're trying to improve convenience and access. And so that's really in talking individually to communities as to what would work for them. We have seen, for example, that it's not always the case that communities want a vaccine bus brought to them. They might want to use one of the static clinics. They might have a preference for that. So it's really just having the conversation. We are aiming to engage influential leaders. You are all in that group of people, but we're also looking for within the community who are the people who community trusts that we can work with, that are happy to work with us, so that we've got that kind of positive framing and, like I said, that social norming of the vaccination. And so that's really what we're trying to achieve. So communication has to always be honest. In the risk-based conversations, it's really important to talk, even though they're those very rare side effects, it is important to talk about them if that's one of the concerns that people have, so that we're really clear about benefits and risks. And we should also be clear about what we don't know, rather than kind of trying to give the impression that we know everything when clearly in this pandemic we don't. We always want to avoid conflict and be as respectful as possible, and using those active listening skills, which are more important in these conversations than the talking from our side, even though I've been talking at you continuously for 40 minutes. So some kind of general tips that people should know about is framing messages in terms of gain. So in other words, rather than saying, if you don't get vaccinated, you might die, which is obviously very negatively framed, you might instead say, if you get vaccinated, it'll keep you out of hospital, even if you got COVID. So it's kind of the opposite of death, really. Appealing to pro-social behaviour, and for some people that will be a more important motivator than for other people. Addressing barriers. So some of those will be information barriers, but some of them will actually be others. You know, does it interfere with, does it interfere with their medications or what have you? But there are barriers that people have that should be considered, and also dealing with misinformation. So I will go through all of these over the next set of slides, but this is a way to approach, or it's one way. So when we start the conversation about vaccination, it's really important to take the time to understand all the concerns that a person might have. So they might start with something like, I'm worried about the safety, and rather than immediately kind of responding to that concern and trying to kind of correct it, the evidence would suggest that we should really keep asking for more. Is there anything else you're worried about? So that we can kind of collect the full suite of concerns. And often it's the last thing people say, which is really the critical one that they perhaps were less confident to say up front. So we should resist what they call the righting reflex. That is where someone says something that is plainly incorrect and you want to just get in there and correct it. It's a natural tendency for all of us, because that will put them on a defence, and it will also mean that you might not hear those three other things that are really the important thing that they haven't yet told you about. So it is a two-way process of listening and talking, and then this will allow you to have a bit of more nuanced response to their motivations. So it is important then to acknowledge a person's concerns, and that the person themselves is validated, but not necessarily the incorrect or the fallacy that they believe. So, for example, you could say things like, it sounds like you're particularly worried about the side effects of the vaccine. So, that's acknowledging a person's concerns, acknowledging what they've said, but not saying, and you're right. So if you see the difference. Another example is, it can be hard to find the information we need. Acknowledging that it's difficult and confusing and, sometimes chaotic for people to get the right information. So when you've collected all the list of things that people are concerned about, and we've kind of acknowledged that's these are reasonable concerns for people to have. It's reasonable to be concerned about something that's new, but then we kind of can move through to, can I share what I know so far? So this is where you'll go to the facts that we've already talked about. You might also say, if there are three concerns, I wonder if we can start with concern, B. Pick the one that you think is the important one, so that you can kind of set a sort of an agenda for the conversation going forward. Through the conversation, it's really important to, you may already know the individual, you may be well aware of their potential motivators to be vaccinated, but if not, you can just ask people, what for you would be a reason to be vaccinated? Even though they've come to you with concerns, they will still be able to articulate, many people, what would be the sorts of things. And it's important that it's within the individual's worldview. So with the young person, for example, you might say, and they might like to travel, that a vaccine is going to mean you'll be able to catch a plane and go overseas. That would be a positively framed motivator for them. So yeah, I guess that's part of that conversation. So if the conversation goes well, then a positive recommendation to vaccinate now is really where you're going to end that. But if it's not going as well, then you can say something like, so if I could summarise, your options are to not vaccinate now or to vaccinate now. So you're being really kind of quite clear about it for people. Deliberately, that sentence ends on vaccinate now, because there is this thing called the recency effect. And so what we're trying to do with these conversations about vaccine is to end our statements on positive vaccination messaging, and that repetition of the positive message, for some people is a technique that can help them kind of fix on the more positive. So now this is for when we've come to the end and the person has said no, that they're not interested in being vaccinated. It's really important that we don't kind of marginalise or set up barriers between us and them as well, because you will have potentially ongoing therapeutic relationships. So an option is to say, if there's an outbreak in South Australia, the risk of COVID is increased, could we revisit your decision then? So we're just trying to leave the door open for a future conversation. So now, misinformation. This is when there are beliefs that are held and they're held with conviction and they're difficult to shift. So people are more vulnerable to misinformation at the moment because there's a lot of uncertainty for some people, a lot of chaos. These sorts of narratives can provide a level of kind of organisation for people that the real world can't. And so, you know, these kind of coherent stories that explain everything is what people need. I'm going to put a cough on you, so excuse me. So general lack of trust in science as well is something that we can see has been increasing, and that's one of the main reasons why this is happening, and it's probably increased particularly in the last 2 years. So, not surprisingly, direct efforts to counter misinformation generally backfire. So, you know, a person says, well, I think this is happening, and you just say, well, it's just not. It usually doesn't work. So, if the misinformation is a big barrier for people, and you do think that it's important to have a further conversation, there are some techniques that people can use. So one is, for some people, understanding that there's an ulterior motivation behind misinformation. So, for example, people make money by directing traffic to their website. I mean, Facebook, actually, I think we've just heard the evidence that actually allowing that kind of more inflammatory stuff creates more participation. So for some people, I guess, bringing a bit of mistrust in the source of their information can be helpful. So, as I said before, repeating factual information is important. Avoid repeating the misinformation. So that's kind of the opposite. Information should be brief, simple, and should focus on why. So why is this information not correct, rather than just kind of stating that it isn't. So this approach comes from UNICEF, where they talk about starting with the truth. So this is a factual statement in response to the misinformation, letting them know that, you know, that we've heard that there's something, we've heard this myth before. So people, for example, we have heard that some people are concerned that DNA is affected. That would be the sort of warning spot fallacy. We would then go to why we think there's something incorrect about that statement. And then we end again on a positive vaccination message. So this is an example. So this goes to the infertility one. And I've deliberately made this short, but you'll get the sense. So, will the vaccine make me infertile? So, fact, there's no evidence that the COVID vaccine causes infertility. And then myth, this is where we talk about what we've heard. Some people have said that it can affect both male and female infertility, believing that it can change your DNA. And then, well, we'll explain why it can't. And I've used very scientific language here, but of course we would change that depending on who we're talking to. COVID vaccines we have don't affect DNA. The instructions in the vaccines help our bodies form an immune response. The vaccine genetic instructions are quickly destroyed and do not go into the nucleus where our DNA sits. And then ending on another fact, there are ongoing studies monitoring the safety of the vaccines all over the world to identify any side effects, and that's where you would then go to your positive recommendation to vaccinate. So these are definitely difficult conversations, but I think really, I don't know that you can go wrong if, as long as what you're not doing is setting up a conflict, and also focusing on the facts, focusing on why the misinformation isn't correct, and doing that, keeping in mind to have the positive vaccination statements have a much higher number of those than repeating the misinformation. So in conclusion, motivational and practical issues will affect whether someone will get the vaccine, and hesitancy is common. So we shouldn't, we should treat it as, unfortunately, kind of normal for people at the moment, because that's just how it is. That doesn't mean we want to normalise it, but it is perfectly reasonable for people to be asking lots of questions about the vaccine and not to have accepted it on face value. Good communication skills will help, and obviously we're wanting to tailor our response to the individual. So keeping knowledge up to date, it's actually a little tricky because things are changing every week, but we will be doing that as well. And if there are updates, significant updates or significant new myths that get propagated, we will certainly be updating this talk. We do need to help people have actual direct physical access. And when we're approaching misinformation, I think we do that in a kind of cognizant, structured way. So I've got a couple of resources here as well that I found particularly useful. So if you wanted to read more, they're very helpful. But otherwise, that's it. I'll stop. Any questions or comments, actually, as well? Interested. So if I can also say then, we are doing this program more broadly, and many of you work with the groups of people that I've talked about having a higher rate of vaccine hesitancy. If you wanted to reach out to us to talk about how we could work together in both the community conversations, in how we would get vaccines to your community in a way that meets your community's needs, and also training. So we're very happy to, especially for community leaders who are really happy to be part of the program, we're really keen to meet with them as well. So I guess we invite you to get in touch with us, whether you want to do that directly or, if I can say, Bernie, by you. But you're more than welcome to email me directly with any questions or approaches for us to work together. That would be terrific.
Yeah, and thank you, Katina, for not just a great presentation, but taking down it to the level at which most people can explain some of the issues that they're facing and be able to address it in a way that gives them confidence to have that conversation. Because I guess without the tools and tactics, sometimes it can be difficult to have the conversation in a way that actually may change the outcome for the individual. So thank you for that. And I would say to everybody online, whether that's reaching out to Katina through Wellbeing SA or through us through the PHN, happy to work with Wellbeing SA and yourselves to be able to make sure that we give you the right tools and tactics to be able to take forward. Because I know you all care about your vulnerable populations that sit there with you, but your ability to have a conversation, even if it's just one, if it's 100, will change the outcome for that individual and potentially their families as well. So as we get to a stage where we do open up and the risk of increase for some of our very vulnerable populations increase, I guess, you're part of the solution as well as the ability to be able to change the direction that we go in, especially in country. We've seen exposure sites there of recent times, the risk factor for country actually increases day by day, week by week. So I guess, collectively we can address some of the opportunities and hesitancy to be able to get vaccinated. And as you know, we're working with a number of GPs, Commonwealth vaccination clinics, with SA Health as well, to be able to make sure that vaccines are available. And ideally, if we have to, not have to, we want to put in, solutions that meet the consumers where they're at. Very happy to work with you to do so.
Good resource. Okay, so these are good resources here, but what I'll do as well is I'll add a slide that is the reference list that I used to pull this together. And I think it would be good for me to set up I don't know if it's a SharePoint or how we will do it, but a place so that we can send you the communications resources we have. So the FAQ type stuff there's a general one, there's one that's been prepared for Aboriginal community, and there's also some prepared for people who have English as a second language or low literacy. So I think if people are interested, we can provide all of those, and for them to be on use would be terrific. But everyone would have maybe they don't have my email, Bernie, because you forwarded.
Yeah, well, we can make sure that your email's available for everybody and that you've got their details as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, everybody. And apologies, I nearly made it with my voice. Not quite.
Did a very good job. Well done.
Thank you. See you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.